As usual, we're going to start today looking at the big picture, so we'll cover the basics of circulation and circulatory systems, starting with the types of circulatory systems. Now, the first thing is that some organisms don't have circulatory systems. They don't need them. As we've said, if you're small, if you're simple, if you're flat, you don't need a circulatory system to move things throughout your body. All of your cells can accomplish all of the exchange they need directly, either with the digestive system or the outside environment. But if you do need a circulatory system, all circulatory systems are going to have three components. First is a fluid of some kind. So we'll look at some different types of fluid. We'll name the fluids today. And then next time, we're going to talk specifically about blood and its components. So you need a fluid. And then you need two physical components, two actual structural components of the system. You need vessels that the fluid is going to flow throughout the body, and you need a heart, a muscle that is going to move the fluid through the vessels. So all of the circulatory systems we're going to look at today have these three components: fluid, vessels, and a heart. There are two types of circulatory systems. The first is an open circulatory system. An open circulatory system just means that the fluid is not confined to vessels through its entire circuit through the body. In this case, we call the fluid hemolymph, and the circulatory fluid is the same fluid as the interstitial fluid, which is a word you've heard me use before. This is just the fluid that surrounds all the cells, tissues, and organs in the body. In an open circulatory system, that's the circulatory fluid. You have a heart and vessels that are moving that fluid around the body, but the fluid is not confined to the vessels for its entire circuit. If you look at this figure on the right, you can see we have a heart that has vessels leading into it. There are vessels that lead out of the heart, and then those vessels kind of end, and they just dump the fluid out into the rest of the body. So we have cavities in the body called sinuses where that hemolymph is going to circulate. The heart is going to contract, push the hemolymph into the vessels, and then as the heart pushes, the fluid is pushed out of those vessels into those interconnected sinuses. When the heart relaxes, it increases in volume that draws the hemolymph from the sinuses back up into the heart, and you can restart the process. This is what we see in insects, for example. So here is a grasshopper, and you can see we have the vessels that run along the dorsal side of the body. As the heart contracts, the blood is going to be pushed through those vessels. The blood will circulate through, or I should say the hemolymph will circulate through the cavities of the body and then be drawn back up into the vessels when the heart relaxes. This system operates at low pressure and requires very little energy, but the trade-off is that it is very low efficiency. So the fluid circulates fairly slowly, and you're not actually circulating that much stuff over a given amount of time. We tend to see this type of system in arthropods, and also most mollusks use an open circulatory system. The second type of circulatory system is a closed circulatory system. This is where a fluid called blood is confined to specific blood vessels through its entire circuit around the body. So in this case, we have one or more hearts that pump blood through a network of branching vessels. And you can see that in the schematic right here, where we have a heart, we have vessels leading away from the heart, we have vessels that branch as it goes through all of the tissues in the body, and then they come back together and bring that blood back to the heart. So the blood is a different fluid from the interstitial fluid, and it is confined to those vessels for its entire circuit through the body. This type of system operates at a higher pressure, which means the circulation is more efficient. It does a better job of circulating things like gases and nutrients through the body, but it also requires more energy. You see closed circulatory systems in the annelids, in the vertebrates like us, which we'll talk about in more detail, and also in cephalopods. Most mollusks, as we just heard, have an open circulatory system, but the cephalopods, the things like squid, octopus, cuttlefish, all those, they have closed circulatory systems. For the rest of today, we're going to focus on vertebrate circulation. So we'll start with a big overview of vertebrate circulation. We'll compare the different types of circulatory systems, and then we'll kind of zoom in and we'll finish with the system that humans have, and we'll spend the rest of our time today looking at that type of circulatory system. In vertebrates, we call this the cardiovascular system. Cardio for heart, vascular for the vessels, and so we call it the cardiovascular system. A cardiovascular system involves a heart, which is the muscular organ that's involved in pumping the blood through the body. It also involves blood vessels to carry that blood throughout all the different organs and tissues in the body. And one important feature of this cardiovascular system are capillary beds, which are networks of very small blood vessels where the exchange actually happens between the circulatory system and the rest of the tissues in the body. There are a number of different types of vertebrate circulatory systems, so we're going to start with the most ancestral and work our way up to the most derived systems. We'll start with the system that is characteristic of most fish, and this is called single circulation. And it's called single circulation because there is one circuit through the body. So all of the blood goes into the heart and out of the heart through the whole body and then back to the heart. In a single circulation system, the heart only has two chambers. It has a single atrium where the blood enters, and then a single ventricle which pumps the blood out of the heart through the rest of the system. This system is not very efficient because it has two sets of capillary beds. The first set of capillary beds is located in the gills, so the blood moves from the heart to the gills, it picks up oxygen in the gill capillaries, and then at low pressure moves through the rest of the body and into the body capillaries where it's going to deposit that oxygen and pick up waste gases like CO2 from the rest of those tissues. It's then, still at low pressure, going to move back to the heart to complete another circuit. The reason this is very inefficient is that once you go through a capillary bed, you've dropped the pressure in those blood vessels, so the blood is going to circulate very slowly. By having two capillary beds in sequence in this system, you're making most of the circuit at low pressure, which means the blood is circulating very slowly, which means your exchange is not as efficient as it could be. Amphibians have what we call double circulation. We also have double circulation, but there's two variants of this type of system. The amphibian version of double circulation involves a heart with three chambers. So we have two atria, so we have two chambers where the blood enters, and then a single ventricle that pumps blood out of the heart. But importantly, there are two places that blood can go, each of which has their own capillary beds. One circuit where the deoxygenated blood goes is called the pulmocutaneous circuit. Pulmo, like pulmonary, meaning lungs, and cutaneous, meaning skin. So this is where deoxygenated blood from the body is going to go to the lungs and the skin, pick up oxygen, and then return into the other atrium, the left atrium. Once that oxygenated blood returns to the heart, it gets pumped into the ventricle, and then it goes through the systemic circuit, which pumps that blood through the rest of the capillaries in the body. So these are the capillaries that are supplying like muscles and organs with oxygen and nutrients. The big difference here compared to the previous single circuit circulatory system is that here each circuit only has a single capillary bed. So you can do each circuit at high pressure and then return the blood to the heart at low pressure, but you're never moving towards a capillary bed at low pressure. That makes double circulation much more efficient than single circulation. There is one problem here, and it's the three-chambered heart, and you probably picked up on this. You have deoxygenated blood from the systemic circuit coming into the right atrium. You have oxygenated blood from the pulmocutaneous circuit coming into the left atrium. They are going to mix a little bit in that single ventricle. So some deoxygenated blood gets pumped to the body, and some oxygenated blood does get pumped to the lungs and skin. So that's not as efficient as it could be, and the culprit is the three-chambered heart with a single ventricle. Mammals and birds have solved this problem with a four-chambered heart. So now the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit are completely separate from each other. So we have two atria, a right atrium and a left atrium. We have two ventricles, a right ventricle and a left ventricle, and two circuits, a pulmonary circuit, because that's where we send blood to the lungs, and it's pulmonary rather than pulmocutaneous, because mammals and birds don't do any gas exchange across our skin. And then our second circuit is the systemic circuit, which is the same as what we've already seen. So in this system, the two loops are completely separate from each other, and there is no mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood in that ventricle, because they are two separate ventricles. Now, every year I get the question, is there some kind of intermediate state between the three-chambered heart and the four-chambered heart? And obviously we're not doing this in person, so nobody can ask that question, but the answer is yes, there is an intermediate state, and we see it in non-avian reptiles. So the reptiles other than the birds. And what we see in the reptiles, I'm going to go back to our three-chambered heart, what we see in the reptiles is a partial septum keeping the right and left halves of that heart separate. So there is minimal mixing in there, but basically you have a partial wall between the two halves that routes the blood. So the blood from the left atrium is kind of routed in one direction, and the blood from the right atrium is routed in the other direction, and they really don't mix at all. They kind of go around each other, even though technically there's an opening in that single ventricle where they could mix. The way the kind of partial wall in between is structured, it keeps the two sides pretty well separated. So that's the intermediate state, kind of the evolutionary intermediate between a three-chambered heart and a four-chambered heart, and we see that in the non-avian reptiles. And we're not going to go through the full system right here because we are going to do it right here in much more detail. Now, as you can see, there is a lot of detail for the mammalian circulatory system here. I'm going to go through this entire system, starting with blood entering the heart at the right atrium. You are going to be responsible only for the things that I highlight as we go through this process. So the blood is coming in from the body, so that's the systemic circuit. We can look at that either down here or up here. Those are both part of the systemic circuit. And that blood, that deoxygenated blood, is going to enter the heart via the right atrium. And by the way, a little bit on heart naming conventions, it's based on the organism. So in this figure, the right side of the heart is actually on the left because you're facing it, but in your own body, it's on the right or left. That's where the naming comes from. So we enter the right atrium with our deoxygenated blood, and that blood is pumped down into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, the blood is pumped into the pulmonary arteries, which take that blood to the capillary beds in the lung. So they go either to the left lung or to the right lung, and then they flow back towards the heart via the pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins lead into the left atrium right here. So we have our pulmonary vein leading into the left atrium. We also have a pulmonary vein on this side into the left atrium. When that contracts, the blood is pushed downwards into the left ventricle. And when the ventricles contract, the blood from the left ventricle is pumped into the systemic circuit. So it starts by being pumped into the aorta, which is the largest blood vessel in the body. And from there, it circulates through the capillaries of all of the organs. So we've got capillaries that go through all the muscles, the organs. There's capillaries that go up into your upper body, into your head, supplying your brain, obviously. So we have our capillaries in the systemic circuit. They're shown up here and down here. This figure splits them into two separate things, 7 and 8. I don't know why. It's all happening at the same time. And from there, that blood is going to return to the heart. So that brings us back to our right atrium. And we can start the process again. Now you notice there's some other stuff on here, like the vena cava. We didn't talk about that. If I didn't highlight it, don't worry about it. You are responsible for this circuit that I highlighted here. To summarize circulation in general, we looked at open versus closed circulatory systems. Within closed circulatory systems, we looked at single versus double circuit systems. And within double circuit systems, we looked at systems with a three-chambered heart and systems with a four-chambered heart. So you should be able to compare and contrast all of these different types of circulatory systems and sequence the basic pathway for each one.